The night I told my family my business idea. My uncle laughed so hard he had to set his fork down. Not a polite, uncertain laugh. A full, table-shaking, eyes-watering laugh. The kind that invites everyone else in the room to join in so the person being laughed at understands clearly that this isn't one man's opinion but a collective verdict delivered by everyone who supposedly loved you most. My mother smiled the way she smiled when she was trying to appear neutral while agreeing completely. My father looked at his plate. My cousin recorded a voice memo on his phone, an actual voice memo, right there at the dinner table, because he wanted, he said, to have proof for later. For the moment I came crawling back from whatever disaster this was going to turn into. That was 3 years ago. Last April, a news van pulled up outside the building with my company's name on the door, and the first call I got before the cameras were even out of the vehicle was from my uncle, who wanted to know if he could come. Stay with me, because what happened between that dinner table and that news van is not the story you think it is. It is messier and lonelier and more honest than that. And the moment the cameras actually arrived was the least important part of all of it. If you've ever had an entire room of people who love you decide in unison that your dream was the funniest thing they'd heard all year, subscribe right now, because this story was written in that exact silence after the laughter stopped. I need to take you back to that dinner, because the laughter itself is only half the story. The other half is what I said that caused it, and why the gap between their reaction and my actual idea tells you everything you need to know about the specific kind of dismissal that only families are positioned to deliver. It wasn't a wild idea. It wasn't crypto, it wasn't a pyramid scheme. It wasn't some fever dream invention that existed only in my head. I told them I wanted to start a meal preparation and delivery service, specifically designed for elderly, people living alone in our county, people who couldn't always cook for themselves, who were too proud or too isolated to ask for help, who were slipping through the gaps between what social services provided and what their families, scattered and busy and guilty about it, could realistically manage. I had spent 8 months working as a home health aide, and I had sat in enough small kitchens with enough lonely, quietly struggling people to know that this gap was real and large and almost entirely unaddressed. In our specific corner of the world, my uncle and a man named Gerald, who had worked in municipal procurement for 22 years and considered this to make him an authority on all things related to logistics, business, and the fundamental nature of good ideas, asked me, between laughs, who exactly was going to pay for this. I told him the model was a sliding scale, private pay clients at full price, grant, funded slots for low-income seniors, and a partnership model with county social services that I had already had one preliminary conversation about. He laughed again, a shorter version this time, and said, "Honey, you've had one conversation with a county office and you're calling that a business plan?" And the table, in the way tables do when one strong personality sets the temperature of the room, adjusted accordingly, and the laughing softened into that specific, condescending warmth that is somehow worse than open mockery. The warmth of people who have decided to be kind to you about your delusions. My mother said I should think about going back to school. My father said the market was hard for small food businesses. My cousin, the one with the voice memo, said he respected the heart behind it, but that heart didn't pay rent. I sat with all of this for the rest of the dinner, eating quietly, nodding at the right moments, doing the thing I had been doing at family tables my entire life, metabolizing other people's certainty about my limitations and converting it, privately, into something that burned slow and clean and lasted much longer than their confidence in their own judgment. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just noted in the quiet interior ledger I had been keeping since I was old enough to understand that being underestimated was a resource, if you knew how to spend it, that this room had just told me something useful. They couldn't see what I saw, which meant the thing I was seeing was either invisible or extraordinary, and the only way to find out which was to build it. If you've ever sat at a table where the people laughing at you didn't realize they were handing you the exact fuel you needed to prove them wrong, comment "slow burn" below, because that dinner was the night my timeline started, And what I built inside it is the entire reason that News Van eventually showed up. I want to be honest about the first year, because I think the version of this story people tell most often skips past the part that was genuinely hard, and I've always found the hard part more instructive than the triumphant part anyway. The first year was not a montage. There was no moment where everything clicked into place, and I knew, with movie character certainty, that success was coming. There were weeks where I ran the delivery route myself because I couldn't afford to pay anyone else to do it. Driving a second-hand cargo van I'd bought with savings I'd accumulated across 3 years of home health work. Cooking meals in a certified commercial kitchen I rented by the hour from a church 3 towns over, because commercial kitchen rental was the most affordable way to stay within health code. I had 11 clients in the first month. I lost 2 of them in the second month because one passed away. Something nobody who hasn't worked in elder care fully prepares you for. The way the people you are serving can simply leave without warning, without the narrative resolution that stories usually provide, and you have to keep driving your route the next morning anyway. The grant applications were the part that almost broke me, not emotionally or practically. The paperwork for elder care service grants is designed, seemingly by people who have never had to complete it at 2 a.m. After a full day of deliveries, using grant writing language, I had to teach myself from YouTube, videos and library books because I couldn't afford to hire anyone who already knew how to speak it. I submitted 4 applications in that first year. 2 were rejected. 1 was put on a waiting list that still hasn't moved. 1 came through, a small community foundation grant for just over $8,000, which sounds modest until you understand that it was the difference between my company surviving the winter and me calling my cousin to leave a voicemail on his voice memo that my family had been right. I didn't tell anyone the grant came through. I need you to understand that choice, because I think it's the choice that most clearly shows you the version of myself I was becoming in that first year. I had stopped needing the people who laughed at me to know what was happening, not out of strategy, not to engineer a bigger reveal later, but because at some point, during those alone hours in the cargo van in the rented kitchen, the audience for what I was building had quietly, permanently shifted from the people at that dinner table to the people on my delivery route. 41 clients by month 8, most of them referred by the county social worker who had been that first preliminary conversation my uncle found so amusing, a waiting list real and growing, of elderly people in our county who needed exactly what I had described to a room full of people who thought it was the funniest thing they'd heard all year. Here is the thing about building something for people who genuinely need it that nobody tells you going in. It changes your relationship to success in a way that makes the conventional markers of it feel slightly beside the point. I wasn't thinking about news vans in year 1. I was thinking about a woman named Dolores, 87 years old, who cried the first time I brought her a meal because she told me it was the first time in 4 months someone had knocked on her door who wasn't there to collect something. I was thinking about a man named Herbert who had macular degeneration and couldn't safely cook for himself anymore and had been eating crackers and peanut butter for dinner 3 nights a week before someone at the senior center told him about my service. These were the measurements I was keeping in a notebook I still have, because they were the only numbers that made the 2 a.m. Grant applications feel like something other than paperwork. By year 2, the business had outgrown the church kitchen, the second-hand van, and my ability to run every operational function by myself simultaneously. I hired my first employee, a woman named Rosario, who had 20 years of food service experience and the specific, unhurried competence of someone who has never needed to perform capability because she simply has it. I signed a lease on a small commercial kitchen space of our own. I formalized the county partnership that had been informal for over a year, which turned into a contracted service agreement that stabilized the business in a way the grant income alone never could. And somewhere in the middle of all of this unglamorous, unwitnessed growth, I stopped doing the mental calculation I'd been running since that dinner. The one that tracked how far I'd come relative to what my family had predicted, because I had finally genuinely stopped caring about the comparison, which is the part I want you to sit with before I tell you about the news crew. because I think it's the most important thing in this whole story. And it's the thing that tends to get lost in the version where the cameras arrive and everything is validated and the family has to admit they were wrong. The validation from the news crew was real, and I am not going to pretend it didn't matter, because it did, but it mattered as a consequence of the work, not as the point of it. The point of it was Dolores. The point of it was Herbert. The point of it was the waiting list, which by the time the news van pulled up outside, my building had grown to 63 names, which was the most honest possible evidence that the gap I had seen from inside those small kitchens 3 years earlier was as real and large as I'd known it was. The news coverage came from an unlikely direction. A local journalist named Priya had been working on a series about gaps in elder care, infrastructure in rural and semi-rural counties, and she had been interviewing county social workers as part of her research, and one of those social workers mentioned my company 3 times in one interview, unprompted, as the single most effective privately operated resource their office worked with in addressing the isolation and nutrition gap for seniors who didn't qualify for institutional care but couldn't fully manage alone. Priya reached out to me on a Tuesday. I almost didn't respond for 2 days, not out of coyness, but because I was in the middle of a kitchen equipment issue and a staffing schedule conflict and a grant renewal deadline that all happened to arrive in the same week. And a media inquiry felt like one more thing on a list that was already too long. When I finally called her back, we talked for 45 minutes, and she asked the kind of questions that told me immediately she had actually done the reading, not just the surface reading, but the real reading, the kind that results in questions about sliding scale, models and county partnership structures, and the specific logistical challenges of serving clients in rural areas where delivery routes take twice as long and cost twice as much per head. She wasn't looking for a feel-good story about a nice girl who fed lonely old people. She was looking at an infrastructure story, a policy story, a story about what happens when the private sector identifies a public gap and fills it more effectively than the public system that was supposed to prevent the gap in the first place. The piece ran online first on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon it had been shared by 3 regional news organizations and picked up by a national elder care advocacy publication that had 60,000 subscribers. By Saturday, my inbox had messages from similar small operators in 5 other states who had read the piece and wanted to know how I had structured the county partnership agreement, because they were trying to solve the same problem in their own counties and couldn't find a workable model anywhere. The news van arrived the following Monday from the local television affiliate who wanted to do a visual segment to accompany the written piece, and it was a perfectly ordinary Monday morning. I was in the kitchen doing a quality check on that day's meals. Rosario was running the prep schedule. My second employee was loading the van, and the cameras just arrived and started capturing what had been happening without cameras for 2.5 years, which turned out to be the most honest possible version of the story. The call from my uncle came before the cameras had finished setting up outside. He'd seen the online piece shared by someone in our extended family network, and his voice had a quality I didn't recognize at first before I identified it as the auditory equivalent of the expression my mother had made in the lobby, seen at that recalibrating, slightly disoriented warmth of someone who is being kind to you now that kindness cost them something they previously weren't willing to pay. He said he was proud of me, and I said thank you. And he asked if he could come down and see the operation, maybe be in the segment, and I told him, gently but with the full, clear honesty of a person who has spent 2.5 years not needing anything from him, that it wasn't really that kind of story. He said he understood. I don't think he fully did. But I also didn't need him to. My cousin with the voice memo texted me a string of emojis and then, apparently realizing that was insufficient, called to say he had deleted the recording a long time ago, which I neither confirmed nor denied believing. My father called and said almost nothing but stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, which, as I have learned over the course of my life, is his specific dialect for something that would be pride in a language he knew how to speak. My mother came to the building the following week, Not for the cameras, which had long since packed up and gone, but just to see the place herself. And she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Rosario and the prep operation in the wall I had put up with photos of our clients, and not for display, just for us, just to keep the faces connected to the work. And she said, quietly, "I didn't understand what you were doing. I should have asked more and assumed less." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a correction, applied directly to the behavior that had needed correcting, which is the only form of sorry that ever actually changes anything. I want to tell you what I have learned, genuinely learned, not performed for the camera, learned, from the distance between that dinner table and that Monday morning, with the news van outside my building. I have learned that the laughter of people who love you is sometimes the most expensive form of encouragement available, because it costs you the comfort of their approval and gives you back something far more durable, the knowledge that you can build something real in the complete absence of their belief, and that the building itself will eventually say everything you never needed to say in response. I have learned that the people on your delivery route, the ones who need what you are making, are a better measure of the value of your idea than the people at your dinner table, and that the confusion of these two audiences is how most good ideas get stopped before they can become anything. And I have learned, perhaps most importantly, that the moment you stop building for the people who laughed and start building for the people who need it, that is the exact moment the thing you are building starts to become real enough to survive. My waiting list is now at 91 names. I am in the process of expanding to the neighboring county, which requires a new kitchen space, a new county partnership negotiation, and the kind of operational complexity that keeps me up at night in the good way. The way that means your problem is the right size for the version of yourself you are currently becoming. Rosario is now my operations manager. I have 7 employees. The county contract was renewed last month with a scope expansion that my uncle, who works in municipal procurement, told me was unusually favorable, and I thanked him for the context without pointing out that the person who negotiated it was the same person he once laughed hard enough to have to set his fork down for. Some evenings, when the route is done and the kitchen is clean and the building is quiet, I sit at my desk and look at the photo wall. 81 faces now. 81 people who get a meal and a knock on the door that isn't there to collect something. And I think about that dinner, about my uncle's laugh and my cousin's voice memo and my father's careful attention to his plate. And I don't feel vindicated. Not exactly, or at least not in the way I might have expected to feel when I was sitting in that silence after the laughter stopped. I feel something quieter and more permanent than vindication. I feel like someone who found out what they were made of by accident in a church kitchen at 2 a.m, with a grant application and a second-hand van and a list of people who needed something the room full of laughing people couldn't see. And I think, if you're the kind of person who stays until the end of a story like this, you already know that feeling. And you already know that the laughter, painful as it was in the moment, was never actually the obstacle. It was always the starting gun. If this story hit something real in you, if you've ever sat in a room where your dream became the joke and you had to decide what to do with the silence that followed, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest. The fork going down the voice memo, or the photo wall at the end. I read every single one and they shape every story I bring you next. Subscribe now if you want more raw, real, unforgettable stories about the people who built something extraordinary from the exact place they were told nothing could grow. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next reveal, and stay close, because the next story I am bringing you is even more powerful than this one, and you are absolutely not going to want to miss a single word of how it ends.